I appreciate you guys sticking around for this panel on siting and safety, a false dichotomy. My name is Erin Sutherland, and I'm the Policy and Program Director / Counsel at the Trust, and I'll be the moderator today. I'm joined by Paul Blackburn. He is an attorney with the Bold Alliance. Gillian Giannetti from the Natural Resources Defense Council. She's a senior attorney there. And Steve Kenkel, the chairman of the Shelby County Board of Supervisors in Iowa. So I want to kick off this discussion by talking a little bit about this web of safety jurisdiction. I'm sure all of you guys know that there are numerous parties that are touched by the issue of pipeline safety, and each of them carry their own jurisdiction and responsibilities. You've got federal jurisdiction, state, local, emergency responders, and they're all interested in the final outcome of safety, but they each play their individual roles. And I think that can be really confusing for folks, and that's what we're here to talk about. So this chart kind of divides up those general authorities between PHMSA, FERC, state, and local governments. As you guys know, PHMSA is responsible for these minimum safety standards for inter- and intrastate gas and hazardous liquid pipelines, and these apply to owners and operators of pipelines. They relate to construction, design, operation, and maintenance, but they do not have authority over siting and safety, and they do not have authority over routing and siting. And I think that's where some confusion often comes in. FERC does not have safety standards, but they do have siting authority over interstate natural gas pipelines. States do have authority relating to safety standards, and we know that states have their pipeline safety programs, and they enforce federal standards. They can, for intrastate pipelines, adopt higher safety standards. They also have authority over pipeline routing and siting. I'm sorry, I keep misspeaking there. And then with local governments, they don't have authority over these safety standards, but they might have authority over routing and siting, depending on state law. I know that this is pretty complex. It's a little confusing. I hope that this panel can help fix that confusion a little bit. And I think that this chart from Paul Blackburn is really great for kind of really teasing out what that state and local authority is. This is a chart that shows from the state and local perspective whether or not they are preempted on certain policy issues relating to pipelines. And strategically, I put everything that they can do in green, and you can see it's quite a bit. We've got, most importantly, route, location, and setbacks in green for oil pipelines and CO2 pipelines. Another one that's interesting to people is construction and operation mitigation. So I think this is a really important chart, and I thank you for letting me borrow it, Paul. And some detail about what are these policies that state and local governments could enact. PHMSA wrote a letter to CO2 pipeline operators in the Midwest that have proposed pipelines there, and these are listed in that letter. Controlling excavation activities, limiting land use around pipeline right-of-ways. Things like this are traditionally within state and local governments, and this is true with respect to pipeline issues as well. And I put this one at the bottom in big bold because I think people are very confused about the fact that safety as a factor in location decisions is within state and local jurisdiction, and we have precedent establishing that. So I know that this might be a little confusing. I've got these experts. I think that they can help provide some local experience with that from Steve, and then some legal experience with that from these two. So I'm going to start with a couple of questions. My first question is for you to please introduce yourself, your work, and how you're involved in the issue of siting and safety. I'll begin with you, Gillian. Sorry.
Hello, everyone. Again, as Erin said, my name is Gillian Giannetti. I'm a senior attorney at the Natural Resources Defense Council, and specifically within our Sustainable FERC project. I am amongst some of the few people where I don't need to define what FERC is, for better or for worse. But just in case, it's the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which, as Erin just noted, is in charge of the siting and routing for interstate natural gas pipelines. So in terms of the work that I do every day, I litigate cases having to do with interstate gas pipelines, work with communities, landowners, many of you actually in the audience, and also evaluate whether or not the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission is doing its job to ensure that pipelines are properly evaluated. And I know we'll get into this a little bit more as the conversation evolves, but as my takeaway initially for you to consider, Erin's slide said that the FERC doesn't have safety standards. And that is true. That is 100% true. The PHMSA is the agency that is in charge for evaluating those safety standards and implementing them. And that's because PHMSA is the organization, agency that oversees pipelines once they're operational. However, because the FERC is in charge of evaluating pipelines that are being considered, they do consider safety, or at least they should, under a few indirect authorities. And the one that the two that I'll talk about right now, and then I'm certain we'll get into it more, are the Federal Natural Gas Act and the National Environmental Policy Act. So under the Natural Gas Act, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has the authority to review interstate gas pipelines. And the standard by which they evaluate those projects is whether or not the pipeline is required to serve the public convenience and necessity. So key words that I want you to hear there: required and public convenience and necessity. By required, it means that if the pipeline is not required to serve the public convenience and necessity expressly under the Gas Act, it's supposed to be denied. Additionally, public convenience and necessity has been interpreted by courts and lawyers, I know lawyers are super popular, to mean the public interest and a market component. Essentially, there's a market demand for the project. Well, what does the public interest mean? Well, there's a lot of case law that goes into that, and I won't belabor the point. But in short, it's all of the factors that relate to the public interest as applied to the execution of the Natural Gas Act. So basically, it's not the general welfare. It's not, this is something that would be good. It's, is this a public interest factor that relates to executing the duties of the Gas Act, which is to facilitate the orderly development of gas supplies. And I think it would be very difficult to argue that ensuring a safe route is not a public interest factor related to the execution of that duty. So even though expressly they don't have safety standards, things like looking at elevation of a route or landslide risk, or whether or not the seismic characteristics of a particular soil, these are absolutely components that should be part of a public interest analysis and should be conducted by FERC. We'll get into a little bit later of whether I think they're actually doing that. The second is the National Environmental Policy Act. This statute covers federal actions, so both PHMSA and FERC, and essentially the agency has to look at all potential environmental factors and potential environmental impacts that may happen from a federal decision, such as approving a pipeline. Now, the question becomes, what is the safety connection to that? Well, if there is an explosion, or if there is a landslide, or is there some other, release of toxic gas, those are inherently also environmental factors that could be related to the decision to approve a pipeline. So my takeaway here is that even though I 100% agree with the slide up on the screen, that there is a division of power between PHMSA and FERC, and it's important to understand it, I do think that it's important to do everything we can as stakeholders in this space to have an effective marriage between these two agencies, because there is no way for PHMSA to be able to do its job if FERC hasn't done its job in the first place. And I'll stop there, and I know others have initial and opening comments.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Paul Blackburn. I'm an attorney and a policy expert with the Bold Alliance. The Bold Alliance is a nonprofit 401c3 organization that supports communities and particularly landowners in pipeline matters. And one of our primary approaches to this is what's called easement action teams, which are essentially legal cooperatives set up for landowners along pipeline routes. I think a lot of you understand that we're working on the carbon dioxide pipeline issues in the Midwest. We have, I believe, not Bold, but the easement action teams have over 1,000 members, 1,000 clients who are represented by private attorneys. That provides them with substantial leverage in a variety of ways. And I think we all understand some of the outcomes of the recent CO2 permitting in North Dakota, South Dakota, and Illinois. And that's in large part from the easement action team structures. Now in Illinois, it's other groups that do a similar model, but the model can be applied all over the country. And I would encourage activists who are not familiar with this model to familiarize themselves with it, because frankly, it takes a lot of resources to engage in these kinds of matters effectively. So how long have I been doing this? Well, I first started working on the pipeline and routings and safety issues back in the Keystone XL fight in 2010. And, at that time, TransCanada was arguing that the states don't have any right to consider safety in routing. And in fact, the state of Nebraska agreed with them and passed legislation that prohibits the state government in its routing process from considering safety. And we think that was a mistake, but they decided to go ahead and do that. And since then, I've seen companies argue repeatedly that nobody has, no government jurisdiction for liquid pipelines has a jurisdiction over considering safety and routing. And we think that's a mistake. But let me just call a question here. Does anybody think that safety should not be considered as a part of routing decisions? Anybody? Anybody think that geohazards should be ignored? Anybody think sinkholes should be ignored? Anybody think that the location of nursing homes and schools and hospitals, explosive factories and other kinds of sensitive facilities should be ignored in routing? I don't think so. We all agree that safety should be considered routing. So the question then, there's two questions that come. The first is who considers the safety in routing? And the second is what kinds of factors, what kinds of safety analysis needs to be done in determining routing. And we get that the pipeline companies have their software which picks in theory a safe route. They put a lot of factors into the routing software and it spits out a route for them. But that is also, like all software, can be changed and manipulated to produce certain outcomes and to prioritize certain issues. But I think that what we're going to be talking about today is the two questions of who has jurisdiction to consider safety and routing. And obviously our position is that for liquid pipelines and intrastate natural gas pipelines, and as Erin mentioned, that we have federal precedents on this, that they can consider safety when they're choosing a route for pipelines, and there's lots of arguments about that. But, you know, the Bold Alliance is a lot we do. We hear that people are very confused by this jurisdictional work, or by all the jurisdictional rules. And a lot of our role, and a lot of my role, has been helping communities to understand these jurisdictional lines and authorities. And even with East Palestine, you know, I was thinking about who has jurisdiction over that. And it's hard for communities to understand what these jurisdictional lines are. And so I'm really glad we're having this today, because it's super important for everyday people to understand who's in charge. So thank you.
Good morning. I apologize to the people up front here. I'm probably putting a pretty good glare out, so I apologize for that. Wasn't expecting this. So first of all, I want to thank Pipeline Safety for inviting me here. And I come from Southwest Iowa. I'm Shelby County Supervisor. My name is Steve Kenkel. I'm completing my 11th year as Supervisor. I'm Chairman of the Board. I've been dealing with the Department Pipeline going on 2 years now. We were the first county in the state of Iowa to pass a zoning ordinance to protect our residents, to protect our economic development, to protect our livelihoods. And as you can see from the slides, that's our role. I want to read you what my duty is according to Iowa State Code. Iowa Code Chapter 331 empowers supervisors with the authority of county home rule and enacting ordinances to protect and preserve the right, the privilege, the property of the county or its residents, and to preserve and improve the peace, safety, health, welfare, comfort, and convenience of its residents. It's a mouthful. My board, there's 2 other board members, we take that very seriously. And so when the pipeline operator, okay, it's Summit Carbon Solutions, who has never built a pipeline before. They're not like the industry I'm seeing here in the room. They're an investment company running after the federal tax credits, want to get in the CO2 business. So I want to say the examples I bring up today is not to throw the industry under the bus, is to make you aware of what's going on out there. I've also been involved with, I've been asked by supervisors from neighboring states, what can we do to protect ourselves? And early on when we passed our ordinance, I had a couple landowners come up to me and say, Steve, how come you're not stopping this? I said, that's not my job. My job is to protect you and the county. And if I spend all my time trying to stop the pipeline and it goes through, I am not prepared, and I have not prepared you for what's coming ahead. So it's never been our intent whatsoever to stop the pipeline. It is to live, we can all live in the same sandbox, but there needs to be rules. And as you see from the chart, and we feel we have that authority, we held, passed our ordinance, we held 4 public hearings to invite the public in, all the stakeholders, even the pipeline operator, to come to these meetings, and let's put an ordinance together we can all live with. They showed up for 3 of the 4 hearings. We had 170-some people speak in favor of the ordinance. Not one person objected to it, written or comments, not even the pipeline company, but 3 of the 4. And a few days after we passed it, we felt good. We all can live by these rules. We gave you everybody input, and 4 days after we passed it, we were filed with a lawsuit, not just my county, but me personally and my 2 supervisors. So that was in November of last year. Then around the 1st of February, we were finding out that they continue to disobey our ordinance. And so we send them a letter saying, hey, you need to get your conditional use permits. You need to be following the setbacks. And when we did that, then they filed another lawsuit and an injunction on us from enforcing our ordinance. And we'll get into this a little later, and Paul's been following our litigation, and he can talk about the injunction and where we're going at from there. But I never thought in my 11 years of being a supervisor that if I ever did get sued, I would probably get sued for not doing my job. I never thought I would get sued for doing my job. And so it seems so distorted. And any time we bring up the word safety, oh, you can't talk about that. That's PHMSA. You can't go there, blah, blah, blah. But yet the state of Iowa, back in the 50s, gave counties and supervisors, as I read here, authority to protect their county, to protect their citizens. But we have somebody coming in here who's never been here before, and that was bizarre from the very start. You know how I learned about a CO2 pipeline coming through our county, through our state? I had a neighbor. I'm a 5-generation century farmer. I live on my century farm. And one of my neighbors, I'm going to be a mile from the proposed pipeline. I had a neighbor call me who's going to be in the direct path of it. He said, Steve, what the hell's going on with this pipeline? And I didn't know what he was talking about. And he more or less wanted to call me a liar. And I didn't know anything. And in all my time of being a supervisor, especially a company coming in that's not familiar with my county, what's always been the practice, and I'm sure it's practice for the industry, you get a hold of them months, if not a year in advance, sit down, here's what we're like to do, what's your concerns, where do we need to go, what's your ordinances, how do we work together? Nothing. And anytime we ask a question or try to do something to protect our county, we get lawsuits. So I'll end with that, and we have other questions.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. So I'm sorry if I'm confusing the panel. I'm going to jump around a little bit in our questions that I provided to you. So earlier this year, PHMSA wrote a letter to 3 CO2 pipeline operators in an attempt to clarify jurisdictional questions that operators, the public, and local governments have about those pipelines. Can you provide some more detail about what exactly was in that letter? Is there anything that could have made things more clear to members of the public and or to local or state governments?
I think that's me. So I don't have the letter memorized, but let me do a little bit of background. This letter was somewhat similar to a letter sent out in 2014 related to similar issues related to TransCanada's Keystone XL pipeline. And the origin for the need for PHMSA writing this letter is because citizens get very confused, as we discussed, about what the jurisdictional boundaries are for PHMSA and what it can and can't do. And, so PHMSA has put out this guidance, and the guidance is useful in a variety of ways, but there are some limitations to it. For example, one of the things that PHMSA made clear is that local emergency response agencies are responsible for their own emergency response plans, because it's citizens and county officials and emergency responders believe and or have been told that they can't do emergency response planning for these pipeline ruptures. Now that's a serious problem. That's really serious. So we're glad that PHMSA did that. I'd say probably the biggest gap, and it relates to this issue today, is PHMSA's lack of jurisdiction over location and routing. I think that most people, lawyers understand it's 49 U.S.C. 60104E expressly says that PHMSA does not have jurisdiction over the location or route of a pipeline. And so because of that, it doesn't. But unfortunately, PHMSA didn't say, we have no jurisdiction over safety and routing, therefore other agencies do. And I think the reason for not being as clear on this is because for liquid pipelines, it's a little bit complicated because it's generally the states that have jurisdiction over routing. But in some states, they allow counties to also have co-jurisdiction or separate jurisdiction over routing. So for example, in South Dakota, the state doesn't control routing. It has a siting law, which is a little bit different. But then the state law allows counties to have ordinances to control pipelines. And the South Dakota PUC finally made clear that counties in South Dakota could control the route of pipelines through their normal zoning processes. So I think that PHMSA could have done a bit more in saying what it can't do. So that means that at least other folks would understand that, and local people and agencies and county supervisors would understand what they can do. There's no vacuum here. There's no gap between this jurisdiction. So, that's, I think, would be helpful in the letter, but maybe it'll be fixed in next round.
If I can just add one point that kind of permeates this whole conversation. So I talk to a lot of journalists who have questions about particular projects. And one misconception, it's a very reasonable misconception that I find is the perception that a pipeline is a pipeline is a pipeline. So, I will get phone calls all the time asking me about an oil pipeline or a liquids pipeline. And I'm certain Paul gets the same thing. And one thing that I hope all of you walk away from this conference understanding is that before you even start to track whose ball it is, the first question you have to know is what's going to be inside it. Because whose ball it is very determined by the commodity that's going to be inside it. You might be asking, why? It's a very reasonable question. I actually did a little research into this. The best that I've been able to figure out is that back in the 1930s, we really, really wanted to promote and expedite the building of natural gas. And so that was why those pipelines were largely federalized. But these other pipelines, including emerging technologies like carbon capture and sequestration and hydrogen, have not yet been addressed. So just as a thing I hope that all of you can walk away from is knowing that being able to answer the question of who's going to be in charge, what questions do I need to ask, and who do I need to ask them of, start from what is inside the pipe, because that is going to help guide that conversation.
Thank you. I appreciate that. My next question is, I'm sorry. Did you have
Can I
another?
address that?
Yeah, absolutely.
I appreciated the letter from PHMSA is a huge encouragement, and there's a whole page in there about local involvement, and it's things we're doing. But the one thing that really I still don't quite understand, and PHMSA addressed this in here, they recommended that the pipeline operators share information, and they gave an example of the flume modeling. I call it dispersion modeling. I don't need the whole flume model of everything. I just need to know the blast zone and the danger zone. In our ordinance, we started our ordinance with 1,000 feet from a residence or animal confinements, because we have about as many animal confinements as we do residents out there. And we started at 1,000 not because we pulled it out of the sky, because our Board of Health, through their diligent research, said that's where we're going to start. And then we want from the pipeline company to give you, when you get it, because at the time they said they didn't have it, their dispersion modeling, and then we'll adjust that accordingly. If we go down to 500 or we go up to 1,500, wherever that ends up to be. To this day, they will not give us that information. PHMSA even recommends, please share that information. So what does that cause? A fear factor in the whole communities, in the whole state. You're hiding something. We're not safe. Well, sometimes I don't feel like I'm living in America anymore. We need transparency. We need to be using the modeling, dispersion modeling, for routing. It's a requirement the pipeline companies have to do. We're using it as reactive, not proactive. We're using it reactive for emergency management when that rupture happens after the fact. Hopefully we get enough people out of the way. Why aren't we using it at the beginning to make sure we get as many people away from it as possible in a proactive approach?
Thank you, Steve. My next question is, in your experience, how does FERC consider safety and routing? And if you could maybe start to discuss a little bit about where that line is between PHMSA and FERC's jurisdiction.
Sure. So going back to my previous comment, the FERC is not in charge of the routing and siting of oil pipelines or liquids pipelines. So what I'm about to say has to do with interstate natural gas pipelines. And it's even more confusing without getting into it, interstate and intrastate is not as clear as entirely within one state or crosses state boundaries. There are, of course, because of lawyers, so many wrinkles on the edges. But for the sake of this conversation, we're just going to talk about interstate, meaning crosses state lines. So everything I talk about when it comes to this question is specifically an answer to those kinds of pipelines. So where is the boundary and how does FERC consider it? Well, when a pipeline developer wants to build a new interstate natural gas pipeline, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which is an independent agency, not part of the Department of Energy, unlike PHMSA, which is part of the Department of Transportation, is the sole agency that is in charge of evaluating that project, facilitating the duties under the National Environmental Policy Act, and coordinating work with state and local authorities to determine whether to approve the project. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, they are guided by a public interest standard, which in my view cannot be divorced from safety, even if the word safety is not used when you're evaluating things such as the route and the risks of that particular route, both to human health and to the environment. Fast forwarding, let's say the project has been approved and has been constructed and is in operation. It is unequivocally clear that once a pipeline is in operation, that the primary responsibility for overseeing the safety of that pipeline is PHMSA, because they are in charge of ensuring the safe transportation of hazardous materials, of which natural gas is considered to be a component, through pipelines. Where it gets fuzzy is when a pipeline has been approved by the FERC, but is still under construction. Of course, competent construction leads to safer pipelines. So it is this is arguably the most important juncture for ensuring that safety is being considered and executed. And yet the lines between where PHMSA has authority and FERC has authority are not clear. I hate to burst the bubble. I know that Erin said in the initial conversation that we were going to hopefully be able to provide some clarity where you would walk away and go, oh, now I get it. I hope I've done that when it comes to the type of commodity and the standards. But I unfortunately cannot do that when it comes to who is in charge of safety for a pipeline that is under construction. It is very unclear because FERC is, of course, in charge of overseeing the safe construction of an approved pipeline. But how can you ensure a safe operation of a pipeline without also having safety officials constantly doing inspections? So both have jurisdiction in this area. This is actually one place where I think it would be incumbent on both the FERC and PHMSA to put out a joint memorandum to the public outlining their understanding of responsibilities in this area. Because one thing that I hear a lot, and I have heard from people over the last couple of days, is that there can be a bit of administrative hot potato where somebody calls and goes, hey, I'm seeing a dredging issue on my property, or my well water is being impacted, or I'm seeing mudslides, and the answer they get is, okay, but that's not us, that's other agency. And then they call other agency and they say, okay, but that part isn't really us, that's them. And then you're sitting there going, well, where do I go from here? And that is exceptionally frustrating. And frankly, I also think that the people who are answering that call need to be more open to answering questions that are even technically outside of their jurisdiction, because people need answers to questions. So when it comes to construction, clearly FERC, and it is through the eyes of the public interest standard and the execution of the Environmental Policy Act, through operation, clearly PHMSA through its authorities. Construction, very fuzzy, needs clarity, and I welcome it from the agencies.
I want to make sure we get to one of these questions, so I'm just going to take over. How can local consideration of siting and safety benefit environmental justice communities? And I also want to hear if you have any knowledge on how failure to link safety and siting in the past has harmed environmental justice communities.
I can start, but I definitely think this is something that I would love to hear my colleagues comment on. Yeah. So, as I just said, when it comes to a natural gas pipeline, the FERC has universal authority in approving the siting and routing of a project. However, most of the folks who work with the FERC live where I do, in the Beltway. I don't think I need to tell many of you that the Beltway is not exactly the most insightful cornucopia of people for determining the impacts of a project in Western Louisiana, Appalachia, Middle America, and having that on the ground insight is critical. It's absolutely critical. So when it comes to environmental justice, considering environmental justice is unquestionably an evaluation under the National Environmental Policy Act. Technically, FERC is actually exempt from the executive orders that require agencies to consider environmental justice, but they do it all the time. So it's kind of a legal point that doesn't really matter. Additionally, I think part of the reason why they do it all the time is because they would be getting into extremely hot water of arguing that they don't have to consider environmental justice because it's more than just the Environmental Policy Act, it's also the public interest standard. And just like Paul asked, like, who amongst you don't want safety to be considered in routing and siting? Who amongst you don't think that environmental justice concerns isn't a public interest factor. I think that would be a pretty bad argument for FERC to have to argue in court. And one thing that has been a challenge is if the federal agencies do not work with local communities to identify potential environmental concerns, they're going to miss them because you can't communicate all environmental justice impacts through spreadsheets that are being evaluated in office buildings in DC. And I'll give one concrete example. So there was a pipeline, you've heard about it a lot, that was proposed, it has been canceled, it was called the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. In this pipeline, there would have been a compressor station located very close to a community that was actually founded by sharecroppers during Reconstruction, and is still a predominantly African American and overwhelmingly elderly community. So of course there were naturally concerns about the environmental justice impacts of placing a compressor station and the safety impacts from air emissions of putting that right next to this already compromised community. The FERC, in evaluating the environmental justice factors, used census tracts as their study area, which on its face makes some sense. Until you think about, and I'm thinking about my colleague here from Shelby County, that in rural America, census tracts can be enormous because they try to balance the number of people and don't care about the area. So the study area that FERC ended up using in determining whether this compressor station would have an environmental justice impact was 500 square miles. That caused a bunch of white communities that frankly would not have been impacted by the compressor station to be included in the sample, diluted the fact that the black community located literally next to the compressor station was there, and the math came out saying, oh, there isn't an environmental justice impact. Had FERC staff contacted county supervisors and local community members as part of their analysis, I don't think that ever would have happened, because there would have been a recognition that these communities are rural, spread out, and that there are pockets of black and brown communities that need to be considered separate and apart from the diffuse white communities that surround them. So I think it's an object lesson in how even when the federal government is in charge, they really need to lay on the expertise of state and local officials.
Yep. So let's talk a little bit about liquid side and particularly carbon dioxide pipelines. I think that you all again are familiar with the Summit, Wolf, and Navigator pipelines in the Midwest. Well, I believe it was Navigator that one of the contracted ethanol plants was in Peoria, Illinois, and I mean inside Peoria, Illinois. It was an industrial zone across a freeway from downtown Peoria. And it went by an EJ community. Okay, so one of the things to realize with CO2 pipelines is that by definition they're going to start at industrial facilities. Therefore, almost certainly many of them are going to go by the communities that live by industrial facilities, which very typically are environmental justice communities. So as this industry, if it's going to develop, is going to need to deal with the reality of having it go through all these, a lot of different environmental justice communities. And that gets into the question of, well, who's at risk and how? And as Steve mentioned, that's into the issue of plume modeling. And the plume modeling here is, there's a bunch of different computer models. The best, we believe, is the computational fluid dynamic modeling. But there are questions about, well, we can figure out the concentration of the CO2, but we don't, and we can figure out how far it go in different topographic and weather environments. But the issue is then, well, what's the human health impact? And there's some gaps in knowledge there. But if we're going to start siting these pipelines in these types of communities, until that knowledge is done, we need to be conservative in terms of figuring out what the potential impacts are to the people along those lines. And this is where, county involvement, either formally through ordinances, or informally through consultation, are really critical because, as Gillian said, the feds don't necessarily know what's going on the ground. They don't know where the people live. They don't know who the vulnerable folks are in their community. They don't know what plans there are for the future for building out new spaces. We know that, for example, Housing and Urban Development has standards for oil and gas pipelines for the setback distances that they're going to do for developing new housing projects. But counties don't know that, and those standards haven't been developed for CO2 pipelines. So it's just to say that, when we're thinking about environmental justice communities, this is going to be a rising issue. There are very specific kinds of technical and scientific questions that need to be answered. And a failure to answer those questions is going to create a lot of concern. I think that some of you may have followed the South Dakota, North Dakota hearings, and the conservative commissioners there were very disappointed, to say the least, in the way the applicants handled those cases because they felt like they were not being open about the potential risks, about the process they used to pick the route, and about the plume modeling. And you know what? Americans don't want to be the designated victims. They want to know what the risks are. They want to be responsible for their own health and safety. And if you think that you can come in and tell people that they don't have a right to understand the risks that they face and that you will take care of them, that, frankly, patronizing approach is not going to fly, with all kinds of people everywhere in the country. And so, on the other hand, if you come up honestly and say what's going on and what the risks are, a lot of Americans will be reasonable about that. I think Americans are generally more reasonable than their leaders are, and they will respond and think about it responsibly, maturely, and thoughtfully. And you need to trust that local governments especially understand who's at risk in their community and what they need to know to keep everybody safe.
I'm going to give you an example of routing that we're facing. When the pipeline company, we first learned they were coming through town or coming through our county, and the line's mostly a north-south straight line. There might be just a little jag, and that's around Erling, a little town, about 600. Otherwise, it's pretty straight. Of course, they admitted to us they do not use modeling in their routing. They said that under oath at the IUB hearings. We have an ordinance in place for 25 years. That's been a priority of our county, and we have a 2-mile setback around every municipality in our county to address mostly housing, which is most housing development in most cities around the outside, protect that, and in a couple larger towns to protect industrial growth. Because we're in charge of the ag land, and this is an industrial pipeline. They needed to come to us for a conditional use permit. We have a variance. You can ask for that. It was totally ignored. It's been there for 25 years, yet we hear from the pipeline company when we revised our ordinance, and we revised it off the same ordinance we had, the 2-mile setback for economic development and housing. They said, well, you guys are changing the rules in the middle of the game. And I go, what? It's been here 25 years. You know how close that CO2 pipeline is to Erling? And our ordinance said 2 miles? 131 feet from the city limits of Erling. The mayor, the city council, the residents have begged them to change it for the last year and a half. We've written to the Iowa Utility Board. They've spoken at the hearings. And all we hear is, well, it's not a high consequential area, like one of the landowners here brought up today. like they don't count, but we had that ordinance in it to protect our county. And here comes just somebody out of nowhere and want to disrupt what we've built for decades, for maybe centuries. So it's very disheartening that the transparency, the trust, the bulliness is going on out there.
All right, I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience. If you have a question, raise your hand really high. We also like to prioritize questions from the public if possible. But I also know some industry folks are super interested in this question, so.
All right, can we get Carl on the phone? I don't think this thing would be up there if Carl was here. Once again, you've excluded tribal. And on that 1185, we added a page and a half about tribal entities, and that's not up here again. And so some of the things you list up there, I don't agree with. When it says exclusively federal safety standards, as a tribe, we've gone beyond that on interstate, but it had to be voluntary with that group. That was the dialogue we had. And so the way, which I don't agree with, I'm strictly against this. The problem with the Keystone, it has an exemption to run at 9% higher than SMICE. Everybody else is 73, they're 82. We made an agreement with them, they cannot go beyond 75. Any pressure increases is not going to be allowed. It has to be done with downstream booster stations. So you can have that dialogue, but it has to be voluntarily with that pipeline group. But you can exceed those standards in those situations. And the pathway forward for you people dealing with this is to have dialogue. You maybe can't stop them, but if I was in that area, and this is what I do upstream, I say in this area where you've got more people, have a greater wall thickness. So that's the strongest link in the chain. So when I go upstream of us and I talk to these pipelines, they're getting greater wall thickness, they're doing bores, but you got to have that dialogue.
I apologize for not including that on this slide, and I appreciate you pointing that out to me directly. Thank you. Let's, got another question over here.
Yes, hello, my name is Lori Simmons. Excuse me, we're going to get through this, right? So I am from Texas. I am an oil and gas baby. My dad was a truck driver that hauled pipe in and out of Louisiana when we were kids. I have family in this industry. I was raised around this industry. I also suffered the consequences of that as well. So I have a question, because in Texas, nobody regulates the route of a project until after it's in the ground. Nobody cares what happens until after it's in the ground. So now we have a project that's coming through a community in West Texas that's a 48-inch high-volume methane pipe, 0.1 miles from a residential community, and nobody regulates it. The Railroad Commission won't regulate it, FERC won't regulate it, PHMSA won't regulate it, DOT won't regulate it. So what are we supposed to do? And we have this company that's coming into this community in 2002 has a record, a mile long, of failure to notify, failure to notify of construction, failure to notify of a leak, and they're getting $32,000 fines, $132,000 fine, but they have a history of failure to report to PHMSA, failure to notify you guys of what's actually going on, and now they're in our community, 0.1 miles from a residential community. Aside from the fact there is no language justice, there's no access. These communities are so rural in Texas and Louisiana, they're so far removed, it's hours to get to where these places are, or sometimes it's a plane. Not everybody can do that. We need to have access to different languages. We have different cultures in both states. We have people that have a wide variety of language needs. We should have access to that. We shouldn't have to bring our own. People should be able to communicate and learn about these things in the language that they're most comfortable in. And if they have questions and concerns, They need to be able to have access to that meeting to talk to y'all so that we can get to the point of where we're getting to solutions. Because what I'm hearing is we're doing more fines, we're doing more studies, we're collecting more data, we're doing all of this, but very little of it is actually transferring to what's happening on the ground. And people are getting harmed today, every day, and we're not getting to anything that's tangible. And this isn't frustrating. This is heartbreaking. We're out here advocating for people, trying to explain that you have like this project that's really close to houses, and it's passing the buck like y'all mentioned earlier. You need to go here, you need to go there, you got to go talk to these people, or it's this people. And then in Texas, we have the whole, is it interstate? Is it intrastate? What makes it international? Where are we going to get to some real hardcore, like, we need to talk. You have to consult communities. We have things that need to be protected. It feels like you're protecting the industry and not the people that are actually suffering with this. And it's getting hard. It's just, we need this consultation. So I'd like just to put that out there. I hear all of this, but that's not applying in Texas and Louisiana. And we need to do something about it really quickly because we're losing people every day over this. Thank you.
A couple things here. First off, I'm sure you've talked to Commission Shift in Texas. There's a need in Texas for amended laws, state laws and regulations. I will say that one of the approaches that you could consider doing is the easement action team model. And the reason for that is that because they still, I would suppose in Texas, still need to go through condemnation process for these properties. And that model has provided communities with a fair amount of leverage because of the increased struggle of doing this. And just let me say, and Steve I think probably knows this better than I do, that the costs for the easements for the carbon pipelines are between 5 and 10 times higher than the cost for oil and gas pipelines. I think I've heard a figure of $350,000 per mile for easements, somewhere around that. And that's because people have joined together. And so, money talks, and working together through a structure like that isn't going to fix all the problems that you're facing, but it may provide leverage to get improved routing and to negotiate. That's all I can say, but the truth is that in states that don't have strong state routing statutes, which are most of the states in the United States, frankly,
I hear what you're saying. I hear what you're saying, and I agree with all that. However, when we start doing the easement action teams, and we show up in groups to these events, and we're trying to get awareness, I'm a water protector that came out of Standing Rock. When we're doing things like this and it evolves into a situation like that, we get criminalized for it. We get treated harshly. I get yelled at on the street. I get threatened. I get all this stuff like I'm the terrorist. I'm just trying to protect my community and my state and the people I love. So you see where there's this divide where you're like, you need to be louder, you need to get out there. But then when we do, we're literally criminalized. It's a felony in my state to do this. That does not connect. I don't have a problem doing that, but when I come to you, are you going to see me as a human being? Or are you going to call the police to come and remove me? We're all humans. These are our communities. This is our land. Some of us are connected through generations and hundreds of years. There's a lot of passion in this. There's human lives at risk in this. I'm in social work. When it comes to human lives, I'm going to get passionate. I'm going to dig my heels in, just like a doctor would in an emergency room when they're trying to save a life. But when I'm doing that, I get labeled the radical. I become the problem. So, do you see where I'm going? Yeah. And y'all are supposed to be protecting us. You're there for us. These laws are to make things safer so that these facilities can be next to human beings in an ecosystem and not kill them. You have children growing up in Lake Charles, in New Orleans, in Houston, in West Texas, in Van Horn, El Paso, growing up in an environment that's actively killing them every day because our water's polluted, our air's polluted, our dirt's polluted. We can't play in the dirt like me and you did as kids. You've got kids now that the dirt puts them in an emergency room on an EpiPen because of all of this stuff we're doing. And it's not just this industry, it's all of it. So it's time that we need to stop. Enough's enough. It's enough. It's not about, I see the past, but we need to fix the future. Look up from looking at the past and actually put some solid stuff in play. Thank you.
All right. Unfortunately, we have to wrap things up, but I really, we appreciate your plight, and, that's what we're working to advance here at all of our panelists here.